session of the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations are about to close, the atmosphere today is charged with a mix of urgency and anticipation. With activities intensifying in the final hours, energy levels are soaring. I'm Sonia Astudillo, GAIA Asia Pacific Senior Communications Officer, and to provide us with an insider's perspective on the dynamics at play, we're joined by Arpita Bhagat, the Plastics Policy Officer at GAIA Asia Pacific. Hi Arpita, how are you today?
I'm all right, just preparing for the last day. Let's hope things go well.
So civil society is saying how this treaty can set high common minimum, and there were conversations on lowest common denominator, showing the disparity between high and low ambition. What exactly do those terms mean, and why do we need to understand them?
Yeah, so the need for an international agreement came because there was no harmonized regulations. Each country had its own regulation, which was mostly focused on plastic as waste, including extended reuse responsibility. Of course, there are countries who are innovating and looking at it to also include midstream, but the expectation, therefore, from the treaty was to set common minimum. That means there are globally agreed targets on reduction of polymer production, on chemicals and polymers of concern. And of course, there are means of implementation that allows for these regulations, this treaty to be implemented specifically for Global South, where financial mechanism is so important. So that's how we arrived at this lowest common minimum. That means this is the minimum level of reduction, minimum level of chemical transparency and traceability, and harmonized regulation and definition around reuse, product design, and many other provisions that are there. Lowest common denominator actually is something that we hear from the not so ambitious countries. Basically, their point is that if you are going to have a very high ambition agreement, then countries are not going to ratify. That means they're not going to be party to it. They won't sign it. Which is why they've been saying that we need lowest common denominator. That means since we are applying rules of procedure, which is only based on decision-making, only based on consensus, we want to have the lowest common denominator so that everyone can agree. But that's just a narrative that has been pushed. We know for a fact, especially from the plenary yesterday, that most countries are in favor of upstream action, and specifically primary plastic polymers reduction.
Okay, thanks, Arpita. So there was also a discussion on specific convention versus framework convention. Can you tell us about more this and why we are advocating for the former?
Yeah, this is not something that most people know. It's more of a UN way of defining different multilateral agreements. So specific convention is a type where the core obligations and control measures are part of the instrument and how it's defined. And you can have additional annexes which could look at the implementation of what it looks like. Whereas if you have something like a framework convention, it's a broad structure. It's a skeletal kind of agreement where basically the idea is, okay, we have this broadly like a common, essentially like a common minimum. And now we'll go into, different conference on parties after this agreement is drafted. And then we will decide what we're actually going to do. So UN FCCC, the very well-known example of the framework convention, where there was no definition of specific targets. And it's basically like an umbrella document which lays down principles, objectives, rules of governance, but not the control measures, not defining what kind of targets, how much mitigation or adaptation, or what kind of means of implementation would look like. So UNFCCC had its Kyoto Protocol as a result of being a framework convention. The Vienna Convention for the Protection of Ozone Layer had its Montreal Protocol, although it's known to be a very famous. But essentially the point is that you spend a lot of resources, time, money to come to define this template the skeletal structure, and then you actually think about what we are going to do and create different protocols out of it. So in the plastics treaty negotiations, the civil society is very clear. We want a specific convention that clearly articulates how much reduction needs to happen, that clearly articulates the pathway for that, that clearly defines reuse and the product design obligations as well as standards. That is, then we can go into expanding on those through the annexes. So for example, right now, if we identify at the beginning of COP with the government, if we identify a particular list, negative list of chemicals and polymers of concern which need to be prioritized in the phase out, we can, with more scientific evidence, we can keep expanding on that annexes and have more sort of group of chemicals, group of polymers being added. So I don't know if that is helpful, but essentially, broadly, the point of the matter is that we need a specific convention to save the time and resources. We want a high common minimum, which is what a specific convention sets, not a lowest common denominator, which is what you see in a framework convention. And then you can go on negotiating it for many, many years. If you think about UNFCCC and when the Kyoto Protocol actually came about, it took years and decades. We don't want that in this. This is plastic crisis is an urgent crisis, and we want an agreement that could be implemented in the near term.
And another term, what about NIP and NAP, or the National Implementation Plan and National Action Plan? How are they different, and which one are we advocating?
So these terms they don't have a specific definition. Their interpretation comes from different multilateral agreements that already exist. So in the case of the Paris Agreement, for example, we have National Action Plan. And the way it's working is that each country defines its nationally determined targets or the NDCs. And in that frame, you basically only focus on the mitigation part. You only focus on what is the how do we get to the emissions reduction pathway. So that is basically your action plans, whereas national implementation plan will look at the entire range of core obligations that you're looking at implementing, and therefore whatever financial mechanism comes in will be implementing all of those measures and not specifically looking at one kind of core obligation, like is the case for National Action Plan. So many global South countries therefore have not been able to finance adaptation measures, right? Adaptation measures are basically measures where how do you prepare for the climate crisis? How do you safeguard and prevent the vulnerability of your communities from the impact of climate crisis, which is already happening? Whereas mitigation looks more broadly at, reduction targets for carbon emissions. So we don't want a national action plan because it will be very limiting. We want an implementation plan which covers the entire, provisions which are in the treaty. Interestingly, here what we see countries using is national plans, which is quite vague. It's not like completely defined. And usually what you hear when it comes to national plans, you usually hear it in domestic context where a country has defined its national plan for a specific issue that it's trying to deal. So it's a lot of vague ground that we are currently on, and these are things which have been discussed in subgroups of contact group 2. And it will be, let's see what we come out with. We have been advocating for national implementation plan, and I think it's important for us to explain to our country, especially in global South, that national implementation plan would be more in their favor in terms of getting financial support.
Okay, so yesterday there was an hour-long discussion, plenary dedicated especially for intersessional work discussion. So before giving us an update, can you tell us why exactly is intersessional work very important for us?
Yeah, so if people would recall, in INC-3, we had discussion on intersessional work at the very last day. The idea with intersessional work is basically getting countries together and getting experts in the room, and of course, getting stakeholders and partners who are especially indigenous peoples and affected communities, race speakers, and so on, to work on defining the different what the provision will look like. So if you're saying that we want to phase out chemicals of concern or hazardous chemicals and polymers, we need scientific evidence to based on a hazard-based criteria, based on safety and sustainability criteria, to tell us which groups of chemical, which groups of polymers need to be prioritized and phased down, which are the worst ones and which are the, of course, there are no good ones, but all of that work needs to happen. Also thinking about financial mechanisms, specifically taking stock of what are the current financial means which are in place with the GEF, with the climate funding, and so on, versus what would a new financial mechanism would look like. So we know there has been division between countries demanding for multilateral dedicated fund for the plastics treaty implementation, but we also have countries who are not in favor of that and want to exercise use of existing funds. So you need to look at these resources. You need to understand what kind of financial flows have happened and so on, and that will require dedicated group of people. So there is talk of an open-ended working group who will look at different pieces of work during the intersessional period, which is the period between two INCs, and come up with recommendations. And before INC-4, there have been multiple countries doing their own intersessional work informally, but we need a formal mandate so that whatever outcome comes from this intersessional open, ended working group work, discussions, whatever we want to call it, is actually taken into consideration in INC-5 as evidence, as ground for work. So it's very important that we come away with this INC, with the mandate for intersessional work, because there is a lot of work to be done. It's not yet done. We have so far not set up any, understood any sort of subsidiary bodies. We know the scientists, independent scientist communities, scientist coalition for an effective plastics treaty has been asking for a science policy panel to be set up. And so far there is, while many countries realize the need for independent science, that means free from conflict of interest, specifically from industry, there has been no mandate. We need a mandate to proceed so that, we also are able to get resources and funding through the different funding mechanisms within the UN systems to actually do that work. So that's where we are at in terms of intersessional work.
How was the Asia Pacific delegation during the plenary last night? Did we hear a lot of good things? I heard Southeast Asia delegates were on a roll last night. Can you share more?
Yeah, I mean, so basically Rwanda and Peru came out with a recommendation for intersessional work, which included work on primary plastic polymers, and this work would basically mean what do we mean by reduction? What is sustainable reduction? What is that number? Is it what number do we want to reduce, and so on? So there is a lot of work that needs to happen. Interestingly, surprisingly, and I think thanks to the work that our members and our civil society groups are doing, we had quite a lot of support in the room. So we had almost, I think, 53, 54 countries. This is including groups like EU and SIDS who supported this proposal and supported the work on primary plastic polymers. The big battle, like we have been saying from many different webinars and discussions we've been having, the big battle for this INC is to keep the provision or primary plastic polymers intact. We don't want to lose it. If we lose it at this point, it's not coming back. And one of the ways to ensure that it's there is to get a mandate for intersessional work on PPP. So a lot of countries spoke in support. Philippines in particular talked about having a criteria for plastic polymers, chemicals of concern across the full life cycle of plastics. They also said the UNEA Resolution 5/14 includes provision promoting sustainable production and consumption, and no downstream measures will stop plastic pollution. And this is huge. This is the kind of validation, this is the kind of win that we have been looking for. And additionally, they also said that basically the chair presented his proposal for intersessional work, which included chemicals and polymers of concern, but it did not include primary plastic polymers. And therefore, many countries made the intervention asking for that to be included. So, in fact, Philippines also said that they support legal drafting group to have clear terms of reference to move this forward. The legal drafting group is basically having legal experts who would ensure that treaty has legal merit and the language that actually is legally valid. So this was quite a surprise. Thailand also interestingly supported the work on intersessional work. They wanted to propose work on defining different things. So we need to recall that a lot of the definitions in the treaty have not yet been looked at. We have, of course, a placeholder for definition in part 1, if I'm not wrong. And in this particular this round of INC, we've discussed sort of scope, objective, principles, but we have not looked at definitions, and that will require dedicated intersessional work. So Thailand also said they want to look at the criteria for specific requirements on product design and performance. They also said that we welcome proposal or intersessional work of polymers proposed by Rwanda and Peru, which was a very, very big moment of celebration for us and our membership from Southeast Asian countries. We also, of course, had Mauritius supporting us, Fiji and SID supporting us, Cook Islands, Uruguay, Micronesia, and of course, Switzerland and EU supporting the work on PPP. All of this information is actually available because plenary is live streamed, so folks can visit it and watch that 1 odd hour of the plenary. And I think we all felt happy and we went to sleep peacefully. Today is going to be an interesting battle because while countries have made statements to support PPP inclusion and intersessional work, so far there has been no sort of signing an official mandate. Today, in the evening, we'll have a plenary and perhaps we feel like it's going to be a long, long night for all of us here in Ottawa, where chair will come back with this new proposal, hopefully with the inclusion of PPP, and countries will have to agree to include PPP and agree to have that mandate on intersessional work. However, this could mean that if consensus is not reached, somebody may call for voting. And if people remember, voting is something that we are trying to safeguard in the rules of procedure of this treaty. So far, we've not had much progress, but tonight may be the time where that actually happens. So this is going to be live streamed, and it's going to be morning for those of us in Asia. So you are welcome to join us online and see the whole drama unfold. And hopefully we will celebrate it together, you virtually and us in person. And when we come back, hopefully we come back to our respective Asian and Pacific countries happy. So far, it's been a good INC. A lot of work has been done. And we have had a lot of progress and very good progress. So let's keep our fingers crossed and please join us online wherever you are tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arpita. So everyone, thank you for joining us. And for more updates, please follow Zero Waste Asia Newsroom and Zero Waste Asia Newsbreak. Follow our social media, Zero Waste Asia on Instagram and YouTube, and GAIA Asia Pacific on Facebook and LinkedIn. See you again later. Bye.